Right, so let me just confirm, can you see that Great American Eclipse symbol picture?
Yes.
Lovely. So this is my story of chasing the Great American Eclipse, August 21st, 2017. It's a very self-indulgent story, so I thank you for sharing your time with me to share my story. It's called the Great American Eclipse because there hadn't been an eclipse in mainland United States since 1979. So here is, I won't try and play the YouTube video, but there's footage here from a ABC News in America from 1979. And at the end of the footage, the newsreader says, "So that's it, the last solar eclipse to be seen on this continent in this century. And as I said, not until August 21st, 2017 will another eclipse be visible from North America. That's 38 years from now. May the shadow of the moon fall on a world at peace." So you can imagine the time that elapsed between 1979 and 2017, probably unusual for a whole continent to go that long without a significant solar eclipse. So there's a lot of anticipation for this event in many years leading up to it. Before we go any further, I'm going to just explain briefly what a solar eclipse is. It's not something we see very often, so I'm not going to assume that everyone is familiar with it. This drawing is obviously not to scale. I hope that much is obvious. But we have the sun on the left, and a solar eclipse is where the moon passes in between the Earth and the sun. And as it happens, the angular size of the moon in the sky is almost identical to that of the sun. And so it just is enough to completely cover the sun, but the path across the Earth's surface where the sun is completely covered is very narrow. And so chasing a solar eclipse means getting yourself in the exact position of that path wherever it occurs. There's typically about one per year somewhere on the Earth, often in fairly inaccessible places. And as I said, this is the 2017 eclipse was the first crossing the continental United States for 38 years. So I hope that makes some brief sense of what a solar eclipse is and what we're talking about. I saw my first total solar eclipse in Africa in June 2001, and it actually had a fairly significant effect on the course of my life, because I used that, the travel to that eclipse became the prompt to then go and spend some years in the UK, and I ended up working in Scotland for 5 years, and that was very much a result of having traveled for the 2001 eclipse in Africa. It also meant that I missed the eclipse in Ceduna, South Australia in December 2002 because I was in Scotland and it was too hard to get back for that. The next one I saw wasn't until the November 2012 in far north Queensland. So here's me with a fair bit of gear that we freighted up, and you can see Nick there in the background. There were 3 of us who freighted a whole bunch of gear up from Melbourne to far north Queensland for that eclipse. So that was the next one. So quite a gap. You could say I didn't certainly become an addicted eclipse chaser after the first one, but the 2012 eclipse did have a significant effect. So it was a couple of years following that Queensland eclipse so it was in about 2014. So this is 3 years before the American eclipse. A colleague, Brad LeBrock, some people might know him in New South Wales, got in touch and was proposing that I joined a U-Design Photo Tours tour in the US as a combination of a landscape photography tour and an eclipse tour. So I was obviously to join as an eclipse photography guide. So there's a bit of the path. There's a bit of the path there, and so you can see crossing the total eclipse is the bit within the green lines in the middle, and towards if you like, just left of center, you can see the path through Idaho and Wyoming and effectively through the Rockies in the Midwest US there. So the reason that area is so well known is because of scenery like this. So Ansel Adams, a very famous photographer, took many of his iconic photos in the area here around the Grand Tetons. Yellowstone National Park is just a little to the north. The Tetons themselves are really well known in the United States, but not necessarily so well known in other parts of the world, but very iconic mountain range and very attractive from a photography point of view. The only issue is that all these photos, so the touristy area or the area that's easy to access and get all these views is on the eastern side of the Teton range. But the eclipse itself was also going to be in the eastern part of the sky. So looking the wrong way, all these photos are taken looking west. So that's something to bear in mind as we go through the story. Here is, so obviously another key factor is weather in general. So these two charts were the weather prospects for average cloud cover in the morning and afternoon for that time of year. Really, the key message here is that there were, in the areas away from the mountains, but in the western half of the United States, the weather prospects were very encouraging. So it's kind of, worth planning an overseas trip around with some confidence that you'd have reasonably clear skies. But around the Tetons themselves, obviously mountains that large create their own weather, and so there's this real dilemma that the mountains create great scenery and very attractive spot to both view the eclipse and be there as a photographer and enjoying the views, but they definitely contributed to a much lower likelihood of clear skies in that area. So there was a bit of tension there in terms of the photography plans and the landscape plans, but what was going to work for the eclipse. I said so Dean was the leader of the U-Design photography tour, and when we finally got talking directly, I said that my main concern around the eclipse was around accommodation, and that bookings that were made several years in advance might get tossed out later on as people realised they could milk much higher prices as the event came closer. But Dean assured me that he had lots of good connections and could lock in the accommodation booking for the group. And he booked us into this lodge here, Jackson Lake Lodge, very similar in appearance to some of those famous Canadian lodges, looking out over a lake and over the Teton range. And so that's the setting there, you can see. So that looked pretty good. Obviously fairly pricey in normal circumstances. And Dean assured me that he had it locked in and we could plan our trip around that. So that seemed like a great base to work from. And then it's pictures like this. Again, you can see in the middle there, or sorry, so three blue boxes from the left, Jackson Lake, Grand Teton National Park, identified as one of the cool places and a very picturesque location to try and observe this eclipse from. The problem being also that mountains also make roads difficult, so the road access in and out of this area quite challenging. So not interstate highways that can carry tens of thousands of people in a day, sort of much more narrow touristy and mountain roads. So Jackson, Wyoming, that's on the eastern side of the Tetons, quite a small town, very limited accommodation, and also just meant that if we were based there, that our options for traveling east or west to chase better weather as we came up to eclipse day would just be that little bit harder as well. So so I guess my goals for the eclipse, and I said to Dean, look, I'm happy to come along as a tour guide, but that I would be trying to take my own photos as well, and be trying to balance, supporting the group, but also my own substantial plans. I was really keen to take photos of the eclipse in the landscape, as well as high resolution views through a telescope. So one of the locations that I found in the research leading up to the eclipse was this spot called Table Mountain. So it's a 3,300 meter summit. It's actually on the western side of the Teton range. And so you could get a view over the Tetons that would have the eclipse behind it in the sky. So I was very keen on that as an option. And I was getting back some basic high school trigonometry and calculations, as I do occasionally when I'm planning these photos. So there's planning out the field of view of what a different focal length lens might have, can see sketching out the path of the sun in the sky through the eclipse, and where the sun would be in relation to that Teton range at the time of the eclipse. But also wanting to try and the colors that you see in the sky during an eclipse tend to are very strong near the horizon. So I was trying to balance getting a field of view of the mountains, but also trying to have the horizon in the shot. So various different combinations and permutations as I plan some of these photos. Ultimately, though, so this is a Google Earth image. You can see Jackson Lake Lodge well up here. So you can see Jackson, Wyoming, the real touristy town for the ski fields in this area down the bottom of the image. Jackson Lake Lodge, best part of an hour's travel north from Jackson. To get round to the walk to access into Table Mountain would be another hour through the mountains and around the Idaho side. And ultimately I decided that if we're based at Jackson Lake Lodge, bearing in mind that I would be jet lagged, driving a foreign car on the wrong side of the road, I thought that the idea of being able to drive 2 hours, do this hike, drive back, and then have to repeat that to retrieve camera gear after the eclipse, I thought that was probably going to be too much. So I largely parked that idea of the photography from Table Mountain and explored other vistas on the eastern, or accessed from the eastern side of the ranges. And so some of those, you could still get into some walks in the canyons beneath or around the Tetons, but these walks were accessed from that eastern side. So I was exploring pictures like this. It's a Cascade Canyon at the base of the Teton range. The view here is excellent, but unfortunately the sun is not. The sun during eclipse time would be too far to the right of that image, so it wasn't quite going to work. And otherwise the canyon was quite sort of steep and locked in, so fairly limited other views. There was this spot here at the base of the canyon where you could see the Teton over the sort of intermediate ridge. And so I was exploring that as an option, and again, had my trigonometry plans, looking at what I could do with different lenses to composite the eclipse over the Teton peak there. So a lot of time, it was around May 2017, just a few months before the eclipse. I was really in detail at that point, navigating Google Earth and drawing up these photo plans and trying to think about what type of walks I could do and where I could leave cameras in the days ahead of the eclipse, where they wouldn't be discovered by other people, and could put them there safely and pick them up later on. So it gives you some idea of the work I was putting in beforehand on the wide field sort of landscape photography side. At home, I was also testing telescopes and various gear for high resolution eclipse photography. So yeah, that's an example of basically setting up the gear exactly as I intended to have it in the US. Not many people try and freight that sort of amount of gear around the world, so it's certainly a bit strange trying to do that. But yeah, that's an example of what I was doing at home in the months beforehand, testing gear there. Just show you one part here. So this is for high resolution eclipse imaging. The eclipse itself is very short, it's about 2 minutes long. And the goal is to take as many pictures as possible during that 2 minutes to capture as much signal from the corona around the sun as you can, and with a whole range of different exposures, because the brightness range of the corona is quite extreme, from the bright corona right near the edge of the sun and the moon to further out towards the edge of the photographic frame. So you develop these scripts with that goal of capturing as many images possible in that 2 minute period, and then have to test that script over and over and over again to work out how much you can squeeze down the gaps between exposures. And so ultimately talking about gaps between the exposures of say 0.3 or 0.4 of a second, making sure that squeezing the gap down as far as you can, but not so much that the camera gets tripped up and gets caught out of sequence, because the minute that happens, then the camera control from the computer can get out of sync, and you can then end up either with basically no photos from that point onwards, or photos taken with the wrong settings on the camera, which is actually something I experienced due to a user error in the Eclipse in 2012. So I partly learnt from that and trying to make sure that didn't happen again. So literally tested this script with the camera hundreds of times on the bench at home to make sure that I got the results I wanted reliably. And yeah, so again, just part of the preparation work I was putting in. It's about this point, so about 2 months before we were heading over to the eclipse, so sort of into June 2017, I started getting contacted by a couple of media companies, people doing film and TV productions, the most significant of which was a company that was planning to produce an IMAX 3D movie about Einstein, and part of the story was going to be about the use of solar eclipses to measure obviously the bending of starlight around the sun during eclipse. So they were hoping to both reenact that and tell that as part of the story. And so they were in touch potentially about what sort of footage I was planning on capturing and whether I'd be able to contribute footage to the movie. So again, all sorts of things going on at this point leading up to the tour. Obviously, I was also thinking about the tour group as a whole, and we're trying to have several options in mind. That the plan A at that stage was that we would be basically close to Jackson Lake Lodge, or we actually needed to be a little bit south of there to be in the eclipse path, but that seemed fine. So that was plan A, to be somewhere near the Tetons. But with that weather constraint in mind and knowing that we might have to move away from the mountains, I was looking at options several hundred kilometers in each direction, east and west, in terms of plan Bs and Cs about where we could locate ourselves. And in the couple of weeks before we got on the flights, actually booked some just very basic observing sites out on the eastern part of Wyoming there, out in the sort of more open desert plains with much more likely prospects of clear sky. So getting close to getting on the flight, this is not the full list, but there's a breakdown of all the gear that I was planning to use during the eclipse. And it was a combination of ways that I was planning to end up in the United States with all that gear. So some of it, obviously, I was carrying as either carry-on or checked-in luggage on the flight, and paying for an extra suitcase. Some of it I was planning on freighting from Ballarat to Jackson Lake Lodge. There was other gear that I was purchasing from photography and astronomy stores over there. So that's the B&H column, and also hiring multiple digital SLRs from Lens Rentals. So obviously I had to work out how to get all that weight into the bags and make it all work. So there's a full spreadsheet there. There's a total of about 180 kilograms of gear that I was planning to work with for the eclipse, which is, again, a bit unusual for people traveling around the world for a week. And then, so Thursday, the 10th of August is 2 days before we were getting on the flights to go and be there a few days before the rest of the group. And I got a call from Brad saying that Jackson Lake Lodge have cancelled our accommodation booking. So we're 2 days out from heading over there ourselves, and a couple of days after that, we've got 14 people coming on a tour, and basically every piece of accommodation anywhere near the eclipse path has been booked out for the last couple of years. So that was kind of my nightmare scenario playing out right there. But somehow Dean said to Brad that he thought he'd found some alternative accommodation, but that it was on the western side of the Tetons. That was going to cause havoc for the landscape photography tour part of the plan, because it meant that the travel time to Yellowstone, where they're planning to do several days, was going to blow out from 2 hours to sort of 6 hours or close to that each way. So it was going to cause them a lot of issues, but for me, it wasn't necessarily that bad an outcome. But I wasn't too sure about this place Dean thought he'd found. But so what it meant is that then on the flight over, this is me in the airline chair, obviously something that seems foreign right at the moment. but this is me looking at topographic maps of the Tetons and having a look again at that route up Table Mountain and thinking about whether it's a hike that I could feasibly do with camera gear and as part of all the rest of the days of activity that I need to do, and looking at where I could possibly plant a camera that would be out of the way of the other people that would likely be in the area on eclipse day and around that day. So everything was happening at the last minute. We flew into Salt Lake City, and so the first full day there was getting essential supplies like SIM cards for phones and bear spray for hiking things like Table Mountain. And yeah, you can kind of imagine how hectic some of those days were. So the next day we traveled up to Jackson, start to pick up the other people joining the tour and sort out their accommodation, which was suddenly being moved all over the place. And of course, yeah, the day we arrived, this is the view over the Tetons, very cloudy, quite intimidating in terms of, okay, yeah, this is the reality of the weather that we might be dealing with, rather than all the optimistic hypotheticals from the other side of the world. So it was a little bit confronting at that point. I'll just check, Mark, you can hear me and pictures are scrolling okay.
On behalf of Mark, Phil, yes, the pictures are scrolling fine.
Great. Thanks, Steve. So our accommodation plans did indeed basically fall apart. So even that day when we traveled, the morning we were traveling from Salt Lake City to Jackson, we didn't actually know where we were going to be staying that night. I managed to find a place in a little town called Tetonia on the western side of the Tetons. And that's actually where we ended up for the rest of the week with the tour group. Compared to Jackson Lake Lodge, it was basically, so in their language, it was an RV park. For us, it would be a small town country motel. So the people in the tour group had paid big dollars to stay in some of the nicest accommodation that you could find. And we've ended up in basically a motel. Fine for me. I had the space and the access to the kind of areas we needed. We were staying in the eclipse path. So to me, that was pretty good that, if all else went wrong, at least we were sitting located in the eclipse path. But yeah, a bit of a disaster unfolding from the accommodation point of view. That the place that Dean thought he had didn't pan out either. So here's me and Brad, and there's all the boxes that I'd freighted and bought and had delivered to Jackson Lake Lodge, and now finally got all in one place, and had a few days to open and unpack and all get hooked up and working again. So those first few days, as well as getting to know the tour group and sorting out all the sort of local issues, I was also then starting to drive around. And so on the days that they went off doing landscape photography, I went out to try and scout locations and identify places where I could do my photography from. Thank you.
While you're having a drink, Phil, we have a question. Hayden Purcell wants to know, did you see any bears?
I did not see any bears while I was location scouting for the eclipse, which I'm reasonably grateful for. I did some hiking after the eclipse and we did see bears then. it is quite disconcerting, particularly on the days when I see all this location scouting and the Table Mountain hikes I was doing on my own. So it's quite disconcerting worrying about bears when you're hiking on your own and in a foreign country. So but I didn't see any. They're definitely around, but yeah, we did see some on hikes later on. Now, so this is the type of, so amongst other things, I was looking for kind of interesting foregrounds where I could do some composite images of the eclipse through the partial stages of the eclipse in totality. And so this is one of those locations I found at, it's called, this was actually North Menam Butte. So there's two old, this is the same geology that Yellowstone Park is related to. So these are extinct volcanic cones, and there's a pair of them, the North and South Menam Buttes. So the Northern Menam Butte, you have to walk up. And so that picture previously was from North Menam Butte. And so I had some options to sort of plant cameras just effectively off the side of the rim there, where you could get a view high up into the sky where the sun was going to be. And the South Menam Butte was actually private property, and the owners, or at least together with the owners, they'd set up a large eclipse observing site there. And so that was really perfect in terms of what I was looking for the group, somewhere that was far enough away from the Tetons that we'd have that kind of good, almost, it's not quite desert, but really dry environment weather, and much less chance of a cloud forming around the mountains at just the wrong time, but giving us an elevated viewpoint where, as the eclipse comes in, you can enjoy seeing the shadow very low on the horizon and really seeing all the light effects of which really need a good sort of clear horizons to experience the best. So yeah, in those days, I both determined locations where I was going to set up my cameras, as well as identified my preferred site for the group. And based on the weather forecasts ahead, had decided that the mountain area still looked a little bit too risky, but that this side of the Tetons was looking pretty good from a weather forecast point of view. So then, this is Thursday, the 17th of August, so 4 days before the eclipse. This is unpacking all those boxes of gear, connecting all the equipment back up, running the scripts again, checking that everything connects and fits and focuses and so on, cleaning sensors in the cameras, which was quite tedious and frustrating. Yeah, and you can't see too much there of the room, but very much a very basic motel room, not the Jackson Lake Lodge glamour that we were expecting, which certainly frustrated some of the tour group. And so then the next day is Friday the 18th, so 3 days before the eclipse. And I decided this is the day, if I'm going to get a camera up Table Mountain, this is the day I have to do it, because the next 2 days need to be really focused on the final preparation and preparation with the tour group as well. So this is me walking along the track, keeping one hand on the bear spray and enjoying the walk. The walk starts at about 2,200 meters. So it's all, you start at a point where you're already sort of just starting to notice the effects of altitude. And as you climb further, obviously that becomes more significant. So a beautiful walk, but quite demanding from it even fairly early on. And this is the first view, just that little, you can see that quite sort of distinctive peak in the distance there. So that's the summit of Table Mountain. You can kind of see how it gets the name as well. And then we've already been climbing up through the valley, but this is then looking at the sort of steeper section of the walk where you have to climb up towards the ridge. Of course, the photo doesn't really convey the steepness, but the path towards the back there starts to traverse backwards and forth across the side of the ridge there. And this is on the way up that part of the walk and looking over the summit of Table Mountain, and that's the summit of the Grand Teton behind it there. So pretty, by this point in the walk, really starting to struggle, wasn't necessarily very fit at the time, and combination of still all that jet lag and lots of stuff going on, and now at reasonably significant altitude and carrying a bit of gear in a strenuous walk. So certainly feeling it, but also really stunning environment to be in, and really, I guess, starting to dream about, oh, what could the photos from this location look like? But also looking at that ridge, the ridge that you can see running from the left side of Table Mountain is partly the ridge that I've been looking at on the maps and wondering about whether I could get, how far down that ridge I could get, and plan the camera out of the way. And looking at, starting to see it now, I was starting to change my assessment of what I thought I could do based on the maps. And a wider field view there of that walk that would just come up from the valley floor, and you can sort of see the ridge and Tetons that we're talking about. Here's me when I finally got to the summit. So a pretty scrambly sort of rocky climb up to the top, but just absolutely phenomenal view. What probably, it's easily the best day hike that I've ever done. Just a stunning location to be. So what I ended up doing, I decided I couldn't get down the ridge to the left, so I ended up basically going straight down the ridge towards the Tetons, partly based on some advice from some other people I was talking to at the summit. And so there's where I've set up the camera, planning to leave it for 5 days or so, and programmed to photograph the eclipse 3 days later after I've left it here. You can see I've got rocks covering one leg of the tripod there, and the legs are splayed out as wide as I can get them. So I thought I had a pretty good setup. I'm gonna try playing this video. Maybe Mark or Steve, let me know if this is really no good and I won't try the other one, but I'll just see how this looks for you guys. I've just realized though, I probably need to share the computer audio. It's Friday the 18th of August, 3 days before the solar eclipse on Monday. It's taken me 6 hours to climb up Table Mountain and find this location, set up the camera. I've just run a test of the time lapse that's going to run on Monday for the eclipse. So fingers crossed it all works as planned. I think the view's not too bad. So I hope you'll agree with that. Just don't look down. So it's a pretty awesome hike. Time for me to pack up and make my way back down the bottom of the mountain. Fingers crossed for Monday. So again, I'm not sure how well that looked for you guys at the other end. I imagine it was pretty fuzzy, but hopefully you can at least hear in my voice what I was doing, and I guess the anticipation of what was going to happen several days later from that location. And with all of the cameras that I set up out on these locations, there were 4 or 5 in the end. I left this post envelope with each of them saying, if you want my camera, go ahead, steal it. I don't care, but can you please send me back the memory card with the eclipse photos? So I was hoping that might salvage the photos, even if somebody did find the camera and want to steal it. That's the sign I saw at the bottom of I came down the mountain a different way, and yeah, probably wouldn't go back up it that way again. here's that view from North Minam Butte. So I've actually got two cameras set up here, one with the solar filter and one without. So one that's going to capture the disk of the sun filtered and showing the partial phases of the eclipse, and the other one that's going to capture the total eclipse against this rocky outcrop on North Minam Butte. So again, these are two cameras set up here. I actually set them up on the Saturday and then realized that I'd messed something up and had to go back on the Sunday and hike back up here again and fix up some of the filter that I had on the front of the camera. So a couple of trips up here. And then, yeah, so that was basically the Sunday night leading up to the eclipse. So I left the rest of the tour group. They were going to stay the Sunday night at our accommodation in Tetonia. But I was now staying at South Minam Butte, sleeping in the back of the car, not sleeping very well, not sleeping very comfortably, but ready on site to get up early and set up gear for the eclipse. It's part of the issue with this. So just before I go back to that, so this is the far western end of the range where I was setting up cameras. So this is what I call Blue Dome, little township further up the highway here. And just on these little foothills on the side of the road here is where I set up one more camera. So you can see that there. So it just meant that I had a sort of fisheye lens there, going to capture a very wide view of the sky. It just meant by spreading cameras over different sites, I had more chance of getting at least one camera with clear weather on the day, and yeah, hopefully different views of the eclipse. And that's the view from where the camera is set up, looking back down to the car. This is a little map here showing the extent of where the cameras I had set up were. So on the eastern side of the image, the camera just down from the summit of Table Mountain. You can see Tetonia there, which is where we were staying with the whole group. And then the north and south Minam Buttes in the middle of the picture, both where I had some cameras set up and where we were going to observe from on eclipse day. And then on the western side of that image, the very foothills of that Beaverhead range there is where the final camera was. So all up, there's a list here of the cameras that must be missing one. All up, I had 12 cameras running on the day. There's a list there of what each camera was, the lens or the optics I was using with it, what tripod or mount it was on, what the power supply was for it, what memory card I had in it. And that was quite critical because the super fast memory cards were really important for both some of the time-lapse footage, being able to capture as many frames per second as I could, but also for the computer controlled stuff, kind of description of what the target was for the image, how the camera was being controlled, and description of the location. So again, a little bit of logistics involved in what I was trying to pull together in one, ultimately basically in 6 minutes of photography on eclipse day. So this is us at our site on eclipse day. This is me doing an impersonation of a telescope here. This is in the lead up to totality, but the partial phases have started and just running over gear. So the two different equatorial mounts. You can see three cameras you can see two cameras on one mount, one camera with a longer focal length telescope on the other, and just down behind my bum on the bottom right, there's another camera that's looking up towards my telescope against where the sun was going to be. I'd set the telescopes up there just in the sort of lee of that rock shelter because it's quite windy when we got up there in the morning. So it's just trying to give the telescopes as much shelter from that as I could. Part of the challenge of this site was that the one big challenge here was that we weren't allowed into the observing area the night beforehand. So for all of us with telescopes and gear, we would really like to have spent the whole night there, being able to set them up, line them up with the stars, get them polar aligned, test the focus and tracking and everything. But we were only allowed access up onto the crater rim around 4:30 or 5 a.m. in the morning. So it was a real rush on the morning of eclipse day to get the gear up there, get it unpacked, get it set up, and be able to polar align it with the last couple of stars still visible in the morning twilight. So that was a very hectic and stressful start, but once I had the gear set up, it was a pretty good place to be. There's the partial eclipse through the main telescope. This was right at the minimum of, or low point of solar activity, but we got very lucky with some quite significant sunspots right on eclipse day. So that was a nice bonus. And then this is now right in the final sort of 30 seconds leading up to the total eclipse starting. And this is really my main memory of observing the eclipse, was just seeing this really, really unusual shadow forming over that horizon coming towards us. And it just got darker and darker and darker. And I almost forgot to sort of look up at the sun as the eclipse started, because you're just so focused on this shadow that was coming towards us. And you'll see that play out a little bit more in the video at the end, but very hard to capture on photos exactly how it looks. But yeah, really ominous feeling of seeing that coming in towards us, and a great vantage point to see it from. There's a shot of the eclipse sun past the telescope. It's hard to convey the kind of change in lighting and how it feels compared to the eclipse in Queensland, which happened in the morning, and therefore the sun's much lower in the sky. That Queensland eclipse felt quite a bit darker. Also had a lot more trees and things around us. Here we had clear horizons, sun much higher in the sky, so that it didn't feel as dark, but certainly felt darker than this photo conveys. You can get a little bit of a sense from the lights on the mountain on the camera. They're reasonably faint little LED lights that have come on during the, or that are visible in the photo. So giving some sense of the fact that it was actually dark during the eclipse. Another thing you can see there is there's actually a thermometer hanging off the telescope. One of the things I learned in the testing at home was basically doing a manual calibration of how the focus on the telescope changes with temperature. And so I was planning, and I did make adjustments to the focus of the telescope through the eclipse. So you get quite a dramatic temperature change during the eclipse, and because the sun's basically getting completely covered, the telescope tube actually cools down in the same way that it does at night, and so it actually cools down below the ambient temperature around it. And so I wanted to be able to track the focus, but without having to interrupt the sequences of capturing the partial phases, and it's very difficult to focus accurately on the sun anyway. So I wanted to do it once well at the start, and then just track the temperature changes and manually adjust the focus. So again, part of the work I was doing to try and get the sharpest and clearest photos that I could. I have only fairly blurry, sketchy memories of 2 minutes of totality. I'd made a late decision to try and capture a panorama during the eclipse. That ended up being a disaster because it was a part of the photographic routine that I hadn't rehearsed. And that's certainly one of my lessons, that any piece of the photographic plans that hasn't been rehearsed does the time over is destined to fail. So so that is the panorama that I captured, but it took a lot longer and was compromised in various ways, but at least gives you a sense of the people spread out around the rim of this old volcanic crater, enjoying this view of the eclipse, and my gear in the middle there. Before you know it, 2 minutes is over, and 3 years or 4 years of preparations all behind you. This is a shot I took with the Einstein movie cap on in case they wanted to use it for publicity purposes. Pretty dorky looking photo. At this stage though, so that the total eclipse is over, but I'm still, the partial phases are still running, and so I'm still capturing those. I'm pretty confident I can hear, based on the way the cameras have run and that the scripts on the computers are still running, that I think the sequences are being captured correctly, but I can't yet stop the camera and the computer to have a look at what I've captured. So everybody else is kind of packing up and going home, and I'm still letting the sequence play out through the hour of partial eclipse afterwards. So when that hour finally finished, and I started playing back through the images on camera, and I scrolled back, and I found basically, I'm scrolling backwards through the photos, and so I've gone back through partial phase and then back to the end of totality, and I can see this sequence of images on the back of the camera where the third contact as the sun is coming out from behind the limb of the moon has happened right where this major prominence is on the edge of the sun that was otherwise, I said, very close to solar minimum. And I could see that the prominence was sharply focused. I could see that the tracking was good, and just, you know, kind of almost overwhelmed with emotion at that point, just in terms of all these plans for 3 years and all of the amazing amount of work in the 3 months beforehand have come together into seeing some of that on the back of the camera straight at the 1 hour after the eclipse. So that was pretty exciting at that point. There's a quick view of the composite image I captured at North Manam Butte. Not necessarily exactly what I had in mind, but still obviously an interesting eclipse image as part of the story. This actually isn't my photo. This is somebody in the tour group that I'd been working pretty closely with. So I'd really helped them plan and execute that composite photo from where we were as the group. The mountains that you can see in the distance on the horizon there are in fact the Teton Range. So somewhere up there, I've got a camera on a mountaintop and you can see obviously that the weather was clear over the mountains, a little bit maybe hazy high cloud in some areas, but you could see the mountains were in fact clear, and maybe that's where we should have been, but you never know. And then this is the view from the camera on that in those little foothills of the Beaverhead Range. Again, you can see the eclipse sun in the sky. It's actually Venus that you can see at the top of the frame. And what you can also see, so on the horizon towards the right, those two little hills are actually the North and South Manam Buttes where we were on the day. But you can also see, and so you'll see this in the video at the end, you can see that interesting sort of shadow in the sky. And you'll see in the video, you can sort of see that move from right to left across the sky. So look out for that in the video, about noticing how that shadow of the moon is moving through the sky in the footage. In terms of the high resolution images through the telescope, it's quite a complicated task processing them. So this is a combination of a few images of a similar exposure range. You can see some filaments of solar corona in the bright area close to the sun, and then adding or averaging some exposures that are slightly longer. You can see that you're seeing detail further out, and taking longer exposures and combining them. You can see details extending further out from the sun, but that the area close to the sun and the moon is now completely blown out and overexposed. And so it took me really the best part of 18 months experimenting in different times, trying to work out processing techniques that would piece this all back together. I started so I got some good results getting to images like this, and then finally piecing together some of the sort of blue hues from some of the wider field images, and finally getting some sort of composite images that I was really happy with in the end. So this one's at second contact as the moon is just about covering the whole sun, and combining it with the wide field images of the corona. Just sort of crop that a bit differently, and right during the middle of the eclipse, you can actually see here quite a lot of detail on the dark side of the moon facing Earth with no sunlight falling on it, just illuminated by the light shining back onto it from the Earth. And then just picking the high resolution parts of that view from the main telescope. So really delicate streamers of the corona, and some of the details of the prominences there as well, but hard to hold the details in there where they're so bright. So it was really, yeah, as I say, took a long time after the eclipse before I managed to get the processing to actually reveal all the work that I'd done in the lead up, but got to a point where I was happy both with the still images and then working on the animation of it. When you watch the video, you have to look a little bit closely, but you can actually see, the disk of the moon moving across the sun, and so you can actually see the sort of effect of the moon moving across the sun, and that sort of difference between second contact where the last bit of the sun disappears and third contact where the sun starts reappearing behind the limb of the moon. So yeah, that's again something to look out for in the movie, and that's why I've called it the moon in motion, because it both in terms of the high resolution view, you can really see the moon moving relative to the sun, and also in the wide field views in the way that you can see the shadow of the moon moving across the landscape. So there's my scientific and artistic interpretation of why it's called the moon in motion. Now, Steve or Mark, that video before, was that at all, could you make something of that? Is it worth showing the equivalent back to the camera?
I've got that ready to go, so I'll take over screen sharing for you, Phil, and get that one going.
Well, just hold on one sec. So the video you've got is the final production. The video I showed just before, the handheld footage from the camera at Table Mountain, did that display well enough to convey what was happening?
It was a little bit jumpy.
It was still okay.
It was still okay. Your audio was perfect.
All right. Yeah, let me play this then. So rather than trying to tell the story, let me play this. There's some fairly raw emotion at the end of this, but this is me when I've gone back up Table Mountain. So this obviously the eclipse happened on a Monday. I was absolutely wrecked at the end of that day and exhausted, and I just wanted to sleep in the next day and worry about all the cameras later on in the week. But when I looked at the weather forecast, there was sort of thunderstorms and things forecast for later in the week, and the top of the mountain summit is no place to be in a thunderstorm. So I said, okay, I need to go and collect this Table Mountain camera immediately the next day. So that's what I did. And here is the video that I captured of myself at the summit of Table Mountain, or back where the camera was when I got back there the next day. Well, today's Tuesday, the 22nd of August. I've just hiked up Table Mountain again. I met several people on the way up that had been up here on Eclipse Day. And I told them about the camera that I had planted here. And they all thought that was pretty cool. They told me about the hashtag Table Mountain Eclipse, and that I'd be able to see the other footage they had, and they'd be able to share the images if they worked. I told them I wasn't sure how it had gone. They also told me about the helicopter that buzzed them, that I figured was probably in Daniel's crew for the Einstein IMAX movie. But then later on, as I got up towards the ridge, I met another couple of people who just hiked up today. And they said they'd actually found my camera, even though it was planted well down the east ridge off Table Mountain. I didn't think anybody would find it. And they told me it had fallen over. And I thought that after 4 days, given that the eclipse was only yesterday, and I remember noticing it being really windy when I was out traveling on Saturday night, I thought, well, the odds are that it's fallen over well before the eclipse. So the rest of the walk since then has been pretty hard, thinking about the fact that the footage probably didn't work. But I've just got here and took a while to play back through the images and find the right bit, but it worked. The camera has fallen over in the last 24 hours, but not in the 3 days before that. So I'm pretty stoked. Just had a bit of a sob, partly because it's very strenuous getting up here to 3,300 meters. But the footage looks awesome. And it's been a very successful eclipse. So I'm stoked and I'm stuffed. So I hope you can imagine, after 3 years of preparation and all the work that went into that, how I guess, yeah, both just physically and emotionally exhausted at that point, but just felt like I was the luckiest guy on the planet at that point, that the footage had worked and that the camera had literally blown over in strong mountain winds in the 24 hours after the eclipse. So the image on screen here is something similar to what I could see on the back of the camera when I got there. On the back of the camera, it's probably still a little bit darker than this, but I could see, and it's what I've been planning right from the beginning, looking at those topographic maps. I wanted to have the camera as high as I could relative to the Teton range to be able to see this, the colors in the sky in the distance, and particularly to be hopefully able to see some of that colors through these saddles in the mountain range. And so even what I could see on the back of the camera, I thought I'd, realized what I'd set out to achieve, and obviously just reassuring that the sun had indeed sort of been where it was intended within the frame. So yeah, just really unbelievable moment picking up the camera and finding it at that point, having for the several hours beforehand thought that it had all been in vain. Bit of processing at home later on, just brightening up the image. This is a version I've got in large format hanging on the wall here. If the house was going to burn down, this picture on the wall would be one of the things I'd be trying to grab and take with me. And yeah, I think obviously I'm very biased and very attached to these photos, but a pretty unique image. There were other people on the summit of Table Mountain on Eclipse Day, but very few people in the world have a photo of a solar eclipse over an iconic peak like the Grand Teton like that. So, and I have it in video as well. And yeah, I'll show it now. Seen it there. So Mark can load up the video, which is the sum of all of that work. But a week afterwards, it's actually my dad. Some of you have probably come across him at times. He'd always wanted to do some walks in Yellowstone and this part of the world. So I said, well, why don't you come across after the eclipse, because I'll be there. And so we ended up doing the walk into Cascade Canyon that I'd previously considered as a location to set up the camera. And what that meant was that we walked right up Cascade Canyon to the base of Table Mountain, and we're looking up at where the camera was planted. And the camera very nearly blew off that rock ledge and tumbled down the ridge there. And I might have been trying to find it from Cascade Canyon, trying to recover the memory card from it one day perhaps. But it stayed up there, and this is, I guess, just shows what that sort of Table Mountain summit looked like. So on that note, Mark, I'll stop sharing and hand over to you to play the video that now everybody understands all the work that it took to put this together.
Now, can we see the screen that I've got there?
I can, yes.
All right.
And you've got your audio, you've got your computer audio shared as well, have you?
Yeah. I'll just double check that. Okay, let's go. All yours again, Phil.
Yeah, so look, I'll paste the link to that on Vimeo afterwards. It's obviously this is the challenge of working in sharing stuff through teleconference. If you can watch it directly through Vimeo, the quality of the footage and the quality of the audio is completely different. And because it's so, because the detail and the color tones are so delicate, I've actually made the original file available to download on Vimeo. So if you really want to appreciate it in the best quality, you can actually download quite high quality files direct from Vimeo and play them on your computer, even in 4K resolution, I think, if it'll let you download that. But yeah, from my point of view, I'd love you to go and look at the version on Vimeo. It does play at a high quality and better audio than what's there, but hopefully you can appreciate the work that went into it. I know that it's a pretty unique eclipse video, and there's not really much else like it at the moment.
I'll second that, Phil, because it's sitting on my iMac, my big 27-inch screen. It's absolutely spectacular.
Worth going and finding the original file. Yes.
Okay, Phil, you up for a few questions?
For sure.
Okay, we'll do
I'll
it.
let you manage.
We'll do it by the chat. So if you've got any questions, please run it through the chat.
But Pete's saying, thank you, Phil, for a brilliant presentation, and thank you for sharing.
Thank you. Good to see some old astronomy colleagues on the chat as well. Thanks, Glenn.
Andrew Worsley's asking, how many days did you spend in the US to set it up?
Yeah, so we arrived in the US on the 12th of August. As I said, we arrived into Salt Lake City. So we had basically 9 days of work from that point to eclipse day. And so, yeah, combination of, that time was split, sorting out my gear, scouting locations, doing hikes up Table Mountain, but also, also a reasonable amount of time with the tour group, coaching them on eclipse photography. And we did 2 rehearsals, the Saturday and the Sunday morning around the time of eclipse. Might have been a little bit earlier in the day, but with the eclipse, with the sun in about the same position in the sky. And we talked everybody through their options and the type of eclipse photography that they could do, and they set up their timer remotes for the cameras and things, and then ran a trial. And because I had the scripts on the computer, those computer software, they actually have voice recordings that say 10 minutes to eclipse, 5 minutes to eclipse. Tells you when to take the filters off 30 seconds before it starts, and then it tells you when the eclipse is about to end and tells you to take filters off. And so everybody's out there running through their routines and their own photography, and it's kind of filters off, and then people are starting to adjust settings on the cameras, and then all of a sudden it's like filters on, eclipse is over, and everybody's like, what? I haven't even started my routine yet. So it's just like, yeah, that's why we practice, and that's why 2 minutes is no time at all. And so, yeah, a lot of people had to sort of readjust their plans and rethink what they could achieve in 2 minutes. And we did it again the next morning, went through, worked with people again that afternoon. Okay, here's what you can change. Here's how to make it work. Another trial again the next morning. Okay, rehearse, and then, the next day. So 2 minutes is not long to try and capture a lot of images. How did I first become interested in eclipse and photography? I guess so. The interest in astronomy dates back to around the age of 16. So I'm sure there's lots of people who can relate to this. So as a family, we used to go out and look at the stars when I was younger, and mum and dad would point out the constellations and things. And then it was about 16 where I started taking it on as my own hobby. But right from that point, it was both astronomy and photography were merged for me. So I was starting to learn my way around the sky in the backyard with binoculars, but also had a couple of film SLRs that Mum had made available from the school she was teaching at. And so right from then, I was combining astronomy and photography, and it's basically been that way ever since, and just got more and more in depth into it, and poured more and more money and more time into it. I guess I've always had an interest in eclipses and aurora and comets, where they're sort of transient or changing phenomena, where what you capture is unique and can never be repeated, and it's very sort of time based, and a bit of that sort of adrenaline in hunting and chasing an event. So that's always been an interest for me.
I don't think we've got any other questions, Steve.
When's the next one?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Phil. I appreciate your efforts on that. And boy, I've chased a few eclipses, and you get stuck up with the photography side of it, and you hardly get a chance to look up. So I hope you did manage to grab some eyeful.
Look, I did get a view of the eclipse, and I had planned. Obviously, everything I'd done there was trying to automate everything so that I could largely look during the eclipse. I really compromised that with a late attempt to capture a panorama that should have taken 20 seconds, but because I hadn't rehearsed, it ended up taking most of the 2 minutes. But I had made a fairly conscious choice that, I'd put so much into photography. I'd seen eclipses before. I was prepared to some extent, sacrifice that visual view, knowing that I was just capturing an amazing amount of photos that I'd have literally years processing. But it was a bit of a balance. I was trying to enjoy the view, and the shadow approaching was really impressive. But I am very frustrated with myself about that late change to try and capture a panorama, and how much of the view I compromised trying to do that because I hadn't rehearsed that part of the photography. So, yeah.